Over recent years, Sunday Night has formed a pretty close bond with the big brother of the Bee Gees, Barry Gibb.
Andy Gibb wasn't just a pop star, he was the golden boy of the late 70s, with a voice that could stop you in your tracks and a charm that seemed untouchable. To millions, he was the perfect package. Young, gifted, and adored. But behind that glittering image lay a reality far more fragile. A story etched with shadows that fame could never hide. Even Barry, the brother who lifted him into the spotlight, would one day confess that deep down, Andy was completely different from who the world believed him to be. And this truth would change the way the world remembers the Gibb family forever. Barry Gibb's rise to fame. Barry Gibb's name is inseparable from the Bee Gees, a group that shaped modern pop culture in ways that few could have imagined. As the eldest of the Gibb brothers, Barry wasn't just a singer or songwriter. He was the anchor, the visionary who steered their sound across decades of changing musical landscapes. From tender ballads to disco anthems that defined a generation, Barry had an instinct for reinvention. But behind all the accolades and recognition, his life carried a complexity that few truly understood. He played a pivotal role in bringing his youngest brother, Andy Gibb, into the spotlight, introducing him to a world of fame and adoration. Yet, that same fame would ultimately become a blessing and a curse that shaped both of their lives in ways that were as inspiring as they were heartbreaking. Barry Allen Crompton Gibb was born on September 1st, 1946, in Douglas, on the Isle of Man, where music was woven into his childhood from the very beginning. When his family relocated to Manchester, Barry began developing a fascination with songwriting and performing. But it was when the family emigrated to Australia in 1958 that everything truly began to take shape. The move gave Barry and his brothers, Robin and Maurice, a new start in a new country, and it was there that their collective love for music transformed from a childhood pastime into a professional pursuit. Barry's first band experience came early. At the age of 9, he formed a skiffle group with Robin and Maurice, along with a few friends, calling themselves the Rattlesnakes. Even in these formative years, Barry stood out as the creative force, penning songs and guiding the group. When the Rattlesnakes dissolved and reformed as the Bee Gees, short for Brothers Gibb, the foundation of one of the most successful groups in music history was officially laid. The early years were not without challenges. The Bee Gees spent the 1960s establishing themselves, and their big break came in 1967 with the release of New York Mining Disaster 1941. The single climbed charts internationally and introduced the world to their haunting harmonies and Barry's distinctive presence as frontman. What followed was a string of successes through the late 60s and early 70s. By the mid-1970s, the music industry was changing rapidly, and many artists struggled to keep up. The Bee Gees, however, reinvented themselves entirely. Barry's falsetto, once a tool he had experimented with, became the centerpiece of their new sound.
You know, I don't tend to look at anything. I don't watch myself, I don't read things.
The timing couldn't have been better. When the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack was released in 1977, it not only redefined the Bee Gees, but also helped catapult disco into a global phenomenon by dominating airwaves, clubs, and charts across continents. The impact was staggering. This soundtrack went on to sell more than 40 million copies worldwide and became one of the best-selling albums in history. Barry, with his soaring falsetto and songwriting genius, became the unmistakable voice of an era. The Bee Gees weren't just popular, they were cultural icons. Their music embodied the energy of the late Juneteenth 70s, giving people around the world a soundtrack for their lives. Beyond performance, Barry's contributions as a songwriter were equally legendary. Over the years, he wrote or co-wrote over 16 songs that topped the Billboard Hot 100, a feat that places him among the most prolific songwriters in pop history. His songs were not only performed by the Bee Gees, but also became hits for other artists like Kenny Rogers and Dolly Parton. The honors and recognition followed. In 1994, Barry, along with his brothers, was inducted into the Songwriters Hall of Fame, an acknowledgement of their unparalleled impact on music. 3 years later, they were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And in 2018, Barry received one of the highest personal honors. He was knighted by the Queen for his services to music and charity. More recently, in 2022, the Australian government recognized him as an honorary companion of the Order of Australia, underscoring the lasting connection between Barry and the country where the Bee Gees first blossomed. But while the statistics and awards tell one part of the story, they don't fully capture the essence of Barry's rise. His career wasn't only about records sold or charts conquered, it was about resilience, adaptability, and vision. He carried the weight of leadership within the Bee Gees, guiding them through reinvention after reinvention. He was the glue that held the family act together, even as fame tested their bonds. And in doing so, Barry's life became defined by his own achievements and by the way he lifted those around him, including his youngest brother, Andy. Yet, that rise to legendary status carried its shadows. For Barry, success always came intertwined with personal trials. And for Andy, the fame that Barry helped him find would become a double-edged sword. Behind the glamorous headlines and record-breaking numbers, there was a private story of vulnerability, pressure, and heartache that most fans never truly saw. Barry's private battles. Behind the dazzling lights of fame and the mountain of records sold, Barry Gibb carried a weight that success could never erase. He had to deal with profound loss, hidden struggles, and the darker side of living in the public eye. While fans saw the confident performer with the soaring falsetto, those closest to Barry knew there were battles he endured quietly, which shaped him as both an artist and a man. The single greatest burden of Barry's life has been loss. The Bee Gees were never just a band, they were brothers. Barry, Robin, and Maurice were bound not only by blood, but also by a creative partnership that carried them from obscurity to worldwide acclaim. That bond was tested time and again, but it remained the core of everything they did. And then, in a cruel twist of fate, Barry became the last surviving brother of the Bee Gees. Maurice Gibb, Barry's twin brother in spirit, though not in age, passed away suddenly in 2003 from complications following surgery. His death was devastating, both personally and professionally. Maurice had always been the peacemaker of the group, the one who could bridge the gap whenever tensions flared between Barry and Robin. Without him, there was a silence that couldn't be filled. Barry described those years as a blur of grief, admitting that he struggled to find meaning in music without the brother who had been beside him since childhood. Less than a decade later, tragedy struck again when Robin died in 2012 after a long battle with cancer. Robin's unmistakable voice and theatrical flair had defined much of the Bee Gees' sound, and losing him meant Barry was not only without another brother, but also without a creative partner who had shared his vision for more than half a century. Standing alone on stage in the years that followed, Barry admitted to feeling the crushing reality of being the last man standing. Despite the adoration of millions and a career few could match, there were moments when he confessed he felt utterly alone. Fame, after all, could never replace family. Barry's struggles, however, didn't begin in adulthood. Even as a boy, he carried scars that were rarely spoken of. In later interviews, Barry revealed that he had narrowly escaped a traumatizing experience when he was just a child. However, though he managed to escape, the experience left an impression on him that lingered quietly for years. For Barry, music wasn't just a career path, It was a refuge, a way of processing fears and emotions that words couldn't always express. While he rarely dwelled on the incident publicly, it was proof that Barry's road to greatness was lined not only with opportunity, but also with hardship that tested his resilience from the very beginning. Even as he navigated personal grief and childhood shadows, there was another challenge that came from outside, and it was the pressures of an industry that could be as fickle as it was rewarding. The Bee Gees reached staggering heights in the late 1970s with the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack, but the cultural tide soon shifted. By 1979, the disco backlash was in full swing. What had once been celebrated as groundbreaking suddenly became a target for ridicule. The most infamous moment came during Disco Demolition Night in Chicago in July 1979, when thousands of disco records were blown up in the middle of a baseball field. Though the stunt was aimed broadly at the genre, the Bee Gees became the unwilling faces of disco's supposed excess. Practically overnight, their image was reduced to a caricature of polyester suits and falsetto voices. For Barry, who had always prided himself on songwriting above all else, it was a painful blow. Behind the scenes, he wrestled with the frustration of being boxed into a single genre. The Bee Gees had been writing hit songs long before disco, and would continue to do so long after. But, in the public eye, they were suddenly branded as relics of a fad. Record sales dipped, radio airplay shrank, and invitations to major events dried up. The industry that had once hailed them as icons now treated them as outcasts. Barry admitted years later that this period tested his faith in himself and his craft. He questioned whether the world would ever see the Bee Gees beyond the disco ball. Yet, resilience was in his nature. Even in those difficult years, Barry continued to write prolifically, penning hits for other artists who went on to top charts in their own right. This ability to adapt, to keep creating even when public favor turned, became one of his defining strengths. Still, the sting of rejection in the wake of such massive success was not something that ever fully disappeared. It was another quiet burden he carried, another reminder that fame could be as fleeting as it was intoxicating. Barry's life was a mixture of extraordinary triumph and equally extraordinary trials. He achieved what few could dream of, from global recognition to artistic immortality, and honors that placed him among the greatest musicians in history. But those who looked closer could see the shadows. The grief of losing brothers who had shared his every step, the private pain of childhood trauma, and the relentless pressure of navigating an industry quick to both crown and condemn its stars. And yet, even with all of this, Barry continued forward, carrying the memories of the brothers who had stood with him and the youngest brother, Andy, who he had once guided into the spotlight. Barry didn't just help shape Andy's career, he opened the door that allowed him to shine. What followed was a meteoric rise that captivated fans around the world. But, as Barry would later admit, Andy's story was as complicated as his own, perhaps even more so. Because while Barry understood the weight of fame and the loneliness that could come with it, Andy was thrust into that world at a much younger age. And the path he took, guided at first by Barry's support, would lead to soaring success, but also heartbreaking consequences. Andy Gibb's meteoric rise. Andy Gibb was born on March 5, 1958, making him the youngest of the Gibb children. Barely 6 months old, he moved with his family to Australia, where his brothers Barry, Robin, and Maurice would begin shaping the path that would eventually make them legends. Growing up in the shadow of 3 older brothers who were already chasing musical dreams was both inspiring and intimidating. But among them, it was Barry he idolized most. Barry wasn't just an older brother, he was a mentor, a figure Andy wanted to emulate in every way. By his teenage years, Andy was already chasing the same passion that had driven his brothers. Unlike the Bee Gees, who had found their footing through harmonies and collaborative songwriting, Andy pursued performance on his own. He cut his teeth playing in bars and clubs in Ibiza, and later back in Australia, honing his voice and stage presence. His charm was immediate, youthful, handsome, and charismatic, because he had the natural magnetism that drew people in. But more than that, he carried with him Barry's guidance and the promise of the family name, which would soon open doors far wider than he might have managed alone. That door swung open in 1977. With Barry's help, Andy recorded and released his debut single, "I Just Want to Be Your Everything." The song, written by Barry specifically for Andy, carried the unmistakable Gibb sound, but with a freshness that set it apart. It didn't just perform well, it soared straight to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. Practically overnight, Andy went from being the youngest Gibb brother to being a pop star in his own right. The success didn't stop there. His follow-up single, "Love Is Thicker Than Water," also hit #1 in early 1978, proving Andy wasn't just a one-hit wonder riding on his brother's reputation. That same year, he released "Shadow Dancing," another track co-written with Barry, Robin, and Maurice, which became his third consecutive #1 single. At just 20 years old, Andy Gibb became the youngest artist ever to achieve 3 consecutive chart-topping hits in America, a record that cemented him as a rising superstar and solidified his place in music history. But his charm extended beyond music. By the early 1980s, Andy had become a fixture on American television. He co-hosted the popular music program Solid Gold, where his boyish looks, smooth voice, and easy charisma made him a fan favorite. He wasn't just a singer. He was a television personality with a natural presence that kept audiences tuning in week after week. Hollywood took notice too, and Andy began landing roles in stage musicals. One of his standout performances was in Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, where his blend of vocal talent and youthful energy made him a natural fit for the role. For a time, Andy's career seemed unstoppable. He had the talent, the looks, the charm, and, most importantly, the support of Barry, who continued to stand behind him, writing songs and guiding his journey. The press hailed him as one of the brightest young stars of the late 1970s, and fans adored him. In many ways, Andy embodied the dream. He had risen from obscurity to international stardom in just a few years, achieving milestones that even some of the most seasoned artists could only envy. But while the public saw a confident young star enjoying the peak of success, behind the scenes, Andy was beginning to face challenges that would test him in ways fame could never prepare him for. His career might have been soaring, but his personal life was already unraveling in ways that were both visible and hidden. Andy endured heartbreaks, struggles with pressure, and the battle with personal demons that fame seemed only to magnify. And as Barry would later admit, Andy's rapid rise carried with it a fragility that no one could ignore. A life marked by heartbreak. For all of Andy Gibb's early success, his personal life told a very different story. Behind the confident smile and the whirlwind of chart-topping singles, Andy was a young man grappling with heartbreak, strained relationships, and battles that fame could only intensify. His journey was marked by highs that dazzled the public, but also by lows that quietly chipped away at him until they became impossible to ignore. Andy's first attempt at building a family came at just 18 years old. In July 1976, he married Kim Reeder, an Australian woman he had met while living there. The marriage was rushed and youthful, with the weight of Andy's ambitions and the demands of the music industry already pressing down on him. By the time their daughter, Peta, was born in January 1978, Andy's career was exploding in America. Instead of embracing fatherhood, he was swept into a life of relentless touring, recording, and public appearances. The marriage could not withstand the strain, and in 1978, only 2 years after they wed, Andy and Kim divorced. The separation left emotional scars. Though Andy adored the idea of being a father, the reality was more complicated. Distance, fame, and his own growing struggles meant that he rarely saw Peta during her childhood. Kim later admitted that she kept their daughter away from the chaos of Andy's lifestyle, hoping to give her a sense of stability. For Andy, the absence weighed heavily. He often spoke of Peta with love, but there was always a sense of regret in his words, a recognition that his choices had cost him the chance to be present in her life during those formative years. By the early 1980s, Andy seemed to find hope for happiness again in a romance that would become one of the most defining and tragic chapters of his personal life. In 1981, he met actress Victoria Principal, already a household name for her role on the television series Dallas. Their relationship was instant, passionate, and for a time appeared to give Andy a new sense of purpose. The two were often photographed together, their chemistry undeniable. Fans loved the pairing, and magazines couldn't get enough of the young pop star and the glamorous television star. But beneath the surface, the relationship was complicated. Andy was already struggling with substance abuse, a problem that clashed with Victoria's career focus and disciplined lifestyle. While she pushed forward with her work, Andy wrestled with pressures he couldn't always control. And it wasn't long before the imbalance eroded their bond. To some in the press, their relationship seemed like a publicity stunt, a pairing of two stars at the height of their fame. But for Andy, it was much more than that. He was deeply in love, and when the relationship ended quickly in 1982, he was devastated. Friends and family would later say Andy never fully recovered from the breakup. It was as though losing Victoria magnified all of his insecurities and deepened his dependence on illicit substances as a way to cope. Barry, Robin, and Maurice did what they could to support him, but Andy was caught in a cycle that was difficult to break. The heartbreak, combined with the pressures of fame and the emptiness he often felt in his personal life, pushed him further into dangerous habits.
You know, when you say it's all over a woman, it sounds pretty weak, but it's kind of true.
The toll on his health became increasingly visible. In the mid-1980s, Andy was hospitalized multiple times for chest pains and stomach issues, conditions made worse by his substance abuse. Though he attempted to stage comebacks, both musically and personally, his body was already suffering from years of strain. By the time he reached his late 20s, Andy's boyish charm was shadowed by the weariness of someone who had lived far too fast. In March 1988, Andy began complaining of severe chest pains at his home in Oxford, England. He was rushed to the hospital, but the damage had already been done, and on March 10, 1988, just 5 days after his 30th birthday, Andy Gibb tragically passed away. The official cause was myocarditis, an inflammation of the heart muscle, but doctors pointed out that years of substance abuse had fatally weakened his body. The news shocked fans around the world. To many, Andy had seemed eternally youthful, the handsome Gibb brother who embodied charm and success. His sudden death was a sobering reminder of the darker side of fame and of the cost that personal struggles can take when left unresolved. Andy was laid to rest at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Los Angeles, the same cemetery that holds the graves of countless other entertainment legends. In the days and weeks that followed, tributes poured in from fans, fellow musicians, and colleagues who had worked with him. His music, especially those first few singles that had broken records, became reminders of the talent that was lost far too soon. For Barry, Robin, and Maurice, Andy's death was more than just the loss of a sibling. It was the end of a dream they had all shared for their youngest brother. And for Barry, Andy's story would become one of the deepest sources of reflection in his own life. Because as much as Barry celebrated his brother's rise, he also carried the weight of watching his fall. Andy's struggles were a family tragedy, and for Barry, the question of what more could have been done would linger for years. The truth about Andy Gibb. Andy Gibb's life was often told through headlines, hit singles, and glamorous appearances, but the truth of who he was ran far deeper than any of that. Beneath the image of a pop idol lay a young man grappling with insecurities, pressures, and a fragility that fame only magnified. From the beginning, Andy was deeply aware of the legacy of his older brothers. Barry, Robin, and Maurice had already built the Bee Gees into one of the most successful groups in the world, and stepping into that shadow was daunting. While Andy shared their musical gift, he often doubted whether he truly measured up. Unlike the Bee Gees, who built their reputation through writing and producing, Andy leaned heavily on his brothers, particularly Barry, for creative direction. Despite having hits that catapulted him to stardom, Andy still had one major problem: insecurity. Fame reinforced a quiet fear within him that he wasn't standing on his own, but by his brothers' efforts. He questioned his songwriting abilities and worried that his success was borrowed rather than earned. This insecurity never left him. Even as fans adored him, Andy often struggled to see himself as more than the younger Gibb brother, constantly measuring his achievements against a standard set by three of the most successful musicians in history. Fame didn't silence Andy's doubts. It made them louder. As his career skyrocketed, he turned to illicit substances, a habit that began in his late teens and escalated during his years in the spotlight. At first, it seemed like a way to keep up with the demands of touring, recording, and public appearances. But soon it became something darker. A crutch he leaned on to escape feelings he couldn't shake. By the early 1980s, Andy's addiction was no secret. It disrupted his work, strained his relationships, and eroded his health. Friends, family, and even fans could see the toll it was taking, but breaking free proved incredibly difficult. In one candid interview on Good Morning America, Andy himself admitted the depth of his struggle, saying, "I've been to hell and back, I suppose, literally. I had a very bad nervous breakdown. I had everything I wanted, and I just blew it all up." Those words captured the turmoil he lived with daily, swinging between moments of hope and periods of relapse that seemed impossible to overcome. Beyond the addiction lay something even more painful, a sense of emotional isolation that Andy carried with him. Despite the adoration of millions, he often felt alone. Fame, rather than curing his loneliness, only seemed to highlight it. The constant attention, the pressure to perform, and the need to live up to an image created a disconnect between who he was in public and how he felt in private. He battled depression and anxiety, conditions that were less openly discussed in the 1980s than they are today. This meant suffering quietly, masking his pain with charm and showmanship on stage, only to return to private struggles when the lights went down. He was gentle, sensitive, and deeply affectionate, but also someone who felt things too intensely, who could be crushed by the very weight of his own emotions. Much of Andy's story has been pieced together through interviews, memories, and later, through the biography Arrow Through the Heart by Matthew Hild. The book sheds light on the untold aspects of Andy's life, painting a portrait of a man adored by many but unable to find peace within himself. He was often described as beloved but lost, a young star who seemed to have everything yet was consumed by feelings of inadequacy and a struggle to cope with fame's relentless demands. For Barry, Andy's struggles were not distant, they were deeply personal. As the eldest brother, he had always felt a responsibility for Andy, guiding him into the industry and helping him find his voice. But watching Andy spiral into addiction and heartbreak left Barry feeling helpless. He later admitted his regret, saying simply, "I'd rather have my brothers back and no hits at all." It was a statement that carried not only grief for Andy, but for Robin and Maurice as well, whose deaths would leave Barry the last surviving Gibb. Barry spoke openly about the pain of seeing Andy's potential cut short, of wishing he could have done more to save him. For a man who had spent his life leading his family through the highs and lows of fame, Andy's story remained a wound that never fully healed. In interviews, Barry often reflected on how fragile Andy was, describing him as a soul who was too sensitive for this world. It was both a tribute and a lament, a recognition that Andy's gifts came with vulnerabilities that fame only sharpened. What do you think about Andy Gibb's struggles? Let us know in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.